Okay, well, everybody, welcome. Welcome to the Biggs Museum. My name is Ryan Grover. I am the Sewell C. Biggs Curator of American Art here at the Biggs Museum of American Art in Dover, Delaware. And the museum is about 26, 27 years old at this point. It was established by a guy named Sewell C. Biggs as an American art, focused on things of sort of national importance. However, we try and focus really, really heavily on stories about Delaware, the Delmarva Peninsula, and the Mid-Atlantic region. And we try and place those stories within sort of a national context. So we specialize in fine and decorative arts, both 1700 up to the present. And the collection, when you come to the museum, is on a timeline basis from about 1700 up to the present. It is about 25 galleries, and we do a big sort of changing exhibitions program, lots of educational programs under really good circumstances, and research. So this today is, this is sort of like one of my first presentations about new research that I've been conducting for about a year for the Biggs Museum. And this was originally sort of formulated to be kind of a case study around the enslavement of workforces by early American craftsmen here within the state of Delaware, but it seemed to have the rules that were governing this kind of practice here in America, or excuse me, here in Delaware, seemed to be pretty consistent across America. So the things that we're talking about within Delaware were happening on a much larger scale. So hopefully this becomes sort of a template for other people to follow as well. So, as many of you will remember, the Next 25 Symposium hosted by the Biggs Museum of American Art at the end of 2018, in the spirit of Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum project at the Maryland Historical Society, 7 researchers were asked to critique the Biggs through the lens of their academic areas of interest within the topic of museum representation and histories of underrepresentation to bring, quote, to light a history and a cultural presence that has been buried beneath layers of neglect and deliberate exclusion. Expanded beyond the underexposed histories of African Americans, the Next 25 broadened its scope and asked its critics to also identify other notable absences within the Biggs Museum's interpretation of, for say, populations of color, people with disabilities, of women, and of the LGBTQ community. While their collective recommendations focused on building equity in exhibitions and programs, strategizing new areas of growth for the collection, diversifying staff and board, these researchers also inspired the staff to think critically about new ways that could be interpreted, about new stories that could be interpreted from the collections that already existed here at the museum. With a background in early American decorative arts, I wanted to see what could be learned about the contributions of ever-present, yet rarely described, enslaved Africans to regional craft production. I knew that slavery was practiced in Delaware until 1865, so I started looking for them at the top of Delaware's decorative arts food chain. John Janvier, who lived from about 1749 to 1801, was the first artisan I looked into, and it felt like providence to discover that he was an enslaver in the last years of his life. The Biggs Museum has a strength of Janvier workshop-related furniture and objects. He is among Delaware's best-known cabinet makers of the colonial period and the best documented of the Biggs the best documented furniture maker at the Biggs. Highlights of this collection are featured prominently within their own gallery, pictured here, a point of pride in Delaware's art history. His signed furniture is prized by art museums and collectors alike, and you can find his work, I think, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, at the Met, and of course places like Winter Museum here within the state of Delaware. Much of what is known about Janvier's early career is printed on an enormous trade card inside this Benjamin Chanley Jr. tall clock, the earliest known piece of Janvier furniture, and this clock presumably dates to the first years of his apprenticeship. The trade card reports that he finished training as a cabinet maker in Philadelphia and took over the shop of Caleb Ricketts in Head of Elk, which was later renamed Elkton, in Cecil County, Maryland on the Eastern Shore in and around 1770. Not mentioned on the trade card is that he soon married Elizabeth March there in 1772. Early in their marriage, the growing Janvier family relocated to Cantwell's Bridge, later renamed Odessa in the state of Delaware, in St. George's Hundred. The Janviers' new cabinet making shop was situated within easy access to the Delaware River and the Kings Highway, connecting to markets in Philadelphia and further south on the Delmarva Peninsula. The couple also became active with Old Droyers Presbyterian Church, and in addition to furniture making, Janvier was also considered an undertaker. The ink drawing of their homestead, rendered by their son Francis de Hayes Janvier in 1798, represents the life that they built together. The homestead, with a stately Georgian house, a small barn or carriage house seen in the back, or sort of the background, and a finely appointed cabinet making shop on the right, enclosed in a neat and ordered fence, was the base of Janvier's craft production and the center of the family's prosperity starting around 1775. Janvier's trade card advertises that he can provide seating furniture, case pieces, desks, bedsteads, and 5 different kinds of tables for his patrons. He may have also been manufacturing or perhaps simply retailing the hardware needed to construct furniture in the late 18th century. Like the vast majority of his fellow craftspeople whose various printed advertisements still exist, Janvier placed a great deal of attention on his status as an independent businessman, his skills and abilities, his interpretation of the latest fashion, his education in cabinet making, and his suitability for local patronage. Like most advertisements of the period, little evidence remains of the networks of talent, labor, and materials that circulated through Janvier's shop to produce the furniture forms listed on the trade card. As a consequence, decorative art scholarship generally, and the Biggs Museum specifically, have till now only credited the man on the trade card who signed the furniture and wrote the receipt. In fact, a great number of seemingly skilled people operated in and through the Janvier homestead. John Janvier was known to have hired his relative Thomas Janvier, presumed one-time apprentice and a cabinetmaker journeyman based in Newcastle, but working throughout the Philadelphia and Delmarva Peninsula to, quote, through or assemble the components of chairs. John's eldest surviving son, Francis de Hayes Janvier, is believed to have studied furniture making with his father, although no signed furniture is currently known. John Janvier advertised for the return of an apprentice named James Heath, who would have been born in around 1773, who left his contracted relationship with Janvier prematurely, of whom Janvier said, or described as very useful in his shop. The junior John Janvier, 1777 to 1850, and his brother Peregrine, 1781 to 1865, likely apprenticed with John Sr., as both grew to be cabinet makers supplying furniture often indistinguishable from their fathers. Add to this large household and cabinet making shop of the late 1790s, Janvier's wife and other small children, as well as 1 and sometimes 2 enslaved Africans. John Janvier Sr. is recorded as having enslaved between 3 to 5 Black people in the last years of his life, from 1797 to 1800. Janvier's 1797 tax assessment for his lot in St. George Hundred in southern Newcastle County lists in his possessions 2 unnamed slaves, one aged 8 to 14 years old, within the range of a young apprentice, and a second one who is either younger than 8 or closer to Janvier's own age of over 45, based on their combined assessed value of $40. The following year's tax assessment in 1798 lists only 1 unnamed enslaved person within the Janvier household, valued at $30, but not assigned an age range. The federal census of 1800 is the first to survive from St. George's Hundred. On it, 2 enslaved people are recorded in the Janvier household, but neither their names nor their wages are listed. John Janvier died the next year in 1801, and his probate of the same year lists no humans. Acknowledging these enslaved workers within the Janvier homestead instantly complicates the appreciation of his work. He is complicit in one of America's greatest atrocities. In addition, the presence of enslaved individuals within this busy cabinet making shop forces researchers to reconsider who the makers may have been, what their stolen talents and labors may have allowed Janvier to achieve, and the myriad ways that they may have contributed to this home and business. Their presence changes everything. Thinking about the authorship of any furniture made in Janvier's shop allows researchers the opportunity to re-examine and perhaps broaden the community of allied artisans that has defined the history of Delaware's, and by extension other regions' furniture making industry. It gives new insight into African-American made furniture forms, even though this inherently speculative research cannot be expected to find the names of undiscovered enslaved master craftspeople. Instead, in the face of an almost total absence, even historical erasure of enslaved biographies, this work would need to build the statistical and historical likelihood of significant contributions of largely unnamed enslaved hands. Despite a complete dearth of publications approaching this topic, especially for furniture makers of northern colonies and states, digital humanities scholarships has begun to help fill this vacuum of perspective with a tremendous number of very recent online databases memorializing the names, associated communities, and at times professions of enslaved Black people through time. Consideration for Black contributions to Southern furniture studies is and has been much more common. However, scholarship, like the two examples that we see here, Thomas Day and the work of David Drake the Potter, scholarship has celebrated the individual achievements of a few Southern exceptions, like Drake, like Day, of free and enslaved African craftspeople, without exploring the confines that obscured the accomplishments of potentially thousands of others. While the exceptions have been publicly lauded, and a few inspiring exhibitions and publication projects have helped to document fine and decorative arts made by both the identifiable as well as anonymous communities of African Americans that contributed to much of America's built environment without credit. What became clear very quickly in this research is that if credit could be given, if enslaved Africans had been as well documented as their artisanal owners, and free Black craftspeople were as celebrated as their Caucasian counterparts, the history of American decorative arts would be crowded with Thomas Day's and David Drake's. As luck would have it, the Biggs had recently received an important gift of chairs that were made in Janvier's shop at around the time he was recorded as an enslaver. This set of chairs was a gift from the descendants of Thomas Hardcastle, 1736 to 1808, and Henrietta Downs Hardcastle, 1739 to 1812, of Goldsboro, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. The gift was accompanied by a 20th century reproduction to make a dining service of 6 chairs, and family notes that describe the history of this furniture from the Hardcastle family ancestral plantation of Castle Hall. 2 separate family members copied portions of the now lost receipt for the chairs, written and signed by John Janvier on November 27, 1795. The family's transcription of the receipts described that the gift was originally from a set of 12 chairs made for and delivered to Castle Hall, along with 2 different dining tables, a dressing table, and a tall clock and movement. Some of the other items on this receipt are still owned by members of the Hardcastle family. According to family tradition, 4 of the original dozen chairs were lost in a fire, and the remaining 3 were given out to the family, or out of the family, earlier in the 20th century. The style of the Hardcastle family chairs, often referred to as either pretzelback or ladderback, was commonly made in the Philadelphia region of the last quarter of the 18th century, although variations were also made in England and New England, and is associated with the cabinet-making shops of Daniel Trotter, Jonathan Gastelow, and others. The chairs have tapered legs in front, H-shaped stretchers with an additional stretcher connecting the rear stiles to create an A formation, and trapezoid seats with through tenons. The chair backs are composed of 4 horizontal pierced slats sawn into a knot or so-called pretzel shape. Janvier's chairs differ from the majority of Philadelphia examples in that they are lighter in weight, The rear edges of their slats are not chamfered nor rounded smooth, like many urban Philadelphia examples, and lacks completely the decorative carving that often delineates the knot design relief. And that is somewhat present here up the ladder back. So there just isn't sort of decorative carving that sort of allows you to understand this as a three-dimensional object. Reinterpreting John Janvier's chairs within a more nuanced understanding of the culture of their production necessitates a combination of American furniture study with Africana research within art museums aligned with recent research of the history of American labor. Janvier's art forms can be seen anew as products of a profession and economy still deeply dependent upon slavery. Before re-examining these chairs, however, it is necessary to realign the interpretive context for understanding furniture made in America at this time. This study will review the history of slavery of the American North before examining the ways that labor, like cabinet making, was learned and practiced by the enslaved within and without the early communities in which they were forced to live. Proof of those skills will be gleaned from the accounts of the formerly enslaved, from the probates of their free contemporaries of color, and unwittingly from the enslavers themselves. Next, the prevalence of enslavers will be examined across the state of Delaware, in Janvier's neighborhood, and among his peers. Once this vantage point is established, it will be applied to a new interpretation of furniture from the Janvier workshop. African slavery was legal in all the British American colonies and eventual states until different points in time across the late 18th and especially 19th centuries. Even though the practice of slavery was outlawed within England in 1772, British citizens still made fortunes on the sale of Africans internationally and through forced labor in British colonial industries such as sugarcane and tobacco for several more decades. Through the nearly 250 years of legal slavery within the United States from 1619 to 1865, millions of the enslaved lived and toiled in both rural settings as well as American cities in a variety of agricultural, domestic, unskilled laboring, skilled artisanal, and seafaring trades. As one historian has summarized, as their numbers increased, slaves moved from the periphery of urban productivity as servants in gentry homes to its center as workers in artisan shops. Slavery was everywhere throughout British North America, and this labor force was utilized in seemingly every industry. The horrors of Southern plantation slavery have been researched in great detail, but the economy of African slavery was practiced far more universally throughout early America than what is commonly discussed. The depth to which slavery had been embraced or shunned within each state was regulated by the government that grew from colonial rule. A unique mixture of racial anxiety based on notions of revolts of the enslaved, cultural tradition, and a desire to defend states' rights was prevalent in each of the nation's early state governments. While Southern states protected slavery for its economic benefits through the Civil War, many of the Northern states started exercising gradual emancipation programs around the time of the American Revolution. In New England, let's take a look at that map. We see a little New England here. In New England, most states began eroding at the economy of African slavery during the Revolutionary period through gradual emancipation plans and legal battles. However, enslaved Africans were still considered taxable property in the 1780s in several areas of New England, and the enslaved were counted on federal census records within many of these states until 1840. Massachusetts is regarded as the first New England colony to embrace slavery, perhaps as early as 1624. And an early interpretation of its 1780 state constitution made ownership of enslaved humans illegal. However, until this point, enslaved Africans in Massachusetts, quote, were the main source of bound labor and outnumbered any other type, including apprentices, indentured servants, and Indians, unquote. 1/4 of 18th century Bostonian households were enslavers, and few were engaged in agriculture. By 1790, at the next census, All of those bound people were manumitted, forced into limited term servitude, died, or sold out of state. Vast wealth was accumulated through the stolen labor, and more importantly, human trafficking within the state of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Enslaved Africans made up a higher percentage of the total population of Rhode Island than in any other New England colony for most of the 18th century. Also, historians estimate that, quote, in the years after the Revolution, Rhode Island merchants controlled between 60 and 90% of the American trade in African slaves, end quote. And while these vast numbers were not recorded in later census reports, many of those people in bondage circulated through the state or its citizens' businesses in other American ports. A gradual emancipation law was passed there in 1784 with a provision that protected human trafficking by the state's merchants. However, enslaved people were still counted on the federal census as late as 1840. New Hampshire and its slave trading port of Portsmouth never had a large permanent enslaved population, but did not abolish slavery until 1856. Although Connecticut held the largest population of enslaved people in pre-revolutionary New England, a quarter of its households owned one or more enslaved Black laborers in 1775 to 76. It began a process of gradual emancipation that counted them on its census until 1840 and finally outlawed slavery in 1848. Alternatively, Vermont illegalized slavery in its 1777 Constitution. In the mid-Atlantic region, Pennsylvania started the first American process of gradual emancipation shortly before the Revolution, and it became law in 1780. Though the first emancipations did not go into effect until 1808, and slavery was not fully abolished from the state until 1847. Much slavery in Pennsylvania clustered around the city of Philadelphia from the 1680s to the 1750s. Perhaps 1 in 15 families were enslavers, preferring instead Scotch, Irish, or German indentured servants. The 7 Years' War in 1756 marked the heightened period of the Philadelphia trade in enslaved Africans as European laborers were recruited for the British Army. In a decade, rates of enslaving jumped to over 20% of all households. That's 1 in 5. While New Jersey successfully voted for a very late general emancipation in 1846, after multiple forms of gradual emancipation legislation passed into law starting in 1804, an enslaved population was still counted in its census materials until the passage of the 13th Amendment. New York also passed 2 gradual emancipation plans. The first that made the children of the enslaved born after 1799 free after as much as 28 years of forced labor that was legally reclassified as indentured servitude, and a second in 1827 that gave any remaining enslavers 10 years to manumit those remaining in bondage, or likely sell them out of state, allowing this economy to linger into the 1830s. In the 18th century, New Yorkers engaged in slavery at a rate higher than in the antebellum South, about 40% of all households. Quote, ranging from those of wealthy elites to artisans with home workshops. The enslaved Africans of Delaware were first recorded in 1639, and this labor force supported the local economy until the federal government passed the 13th Amendment in 1865. While slavery in the southern states ended with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it was still practiced in Delaware and other border states such as Maryland and Missouri for another 2 years. Like northern neighboring Pennsylvania, abolitionist movements proliferated in Delaware during the Revolutionary period, and the local government considered but did not pass into law gradual emancipation programs similar to New York and New Jersey in the mid-1800s. However, the fear of racial inequity, financial losses, and conflict between political parties maintained a diminishing slave labor economy throughout the state until 1865. Possibly to demonstrate its opposition to the federal legislature, Delaware was the last to sign the 13th Amendment, making it the final state in the country in which it was legal to engage in slavery. Delaware infamously did not ratify the abolition of slavery until 1901. Despite a nearly ubiquitous dependence on the forced labor of enslaved people in all areas of early American economy, very little attention has been given to the individual Black people that were forced to support one of the main drivers of this economy, business-owning artisans like John Janvier. While their identities may have been hidden in history, their abilities can be witnessed. Craftspeople like Janvier utilized forced labor in conceivably but rarely defined, diverse, and myriad ways within the house, within the fields, and predictably to build their wares, like the Hardcastle family chairs, within their shops. And before I get started on this next section, I just wanted to take a sort of moment to sort of meditate on plantations. The study of plantations has in the South really blossomed. And this was really sort of, I think really kicked off with a new reinterpretive task around plantations of the founding fathers like Monticello and Mount Vernon, which really helped to establish this sort of new wave of interpretation for Southern plantations all over the place. This is finally beginning to trickle upwards into the Mid-Atlantic and New England areas. And we start to see a great interest in sort of reviving an understanding of the proliferation of plantations throughout the colonies, both North and South, as well as to better understand the purpose for plantations, what they did. So you start to see that a lot of plantations weren't necessarily set up just as agricultural enterprises, but there were also iron plantations and plantations for tanneries and other kinds of craft production that the enslaved were directly engaged within. We know this often because there were a lot of eyewitness accounts. There was a lot of community that came in and through plantations, a lot of different individuals. And so these eyewitness accounts have been combined in some cases with interviews of people who were once enslaved. These interviews being taken during the Depression by Works Progress Administration writers to find consistencies between descriptions of the training and labor of enslaved Africans across America. Attitudes about the professional education and development of enslaved people likely varied between regions and even between enslaving families, and were heavily dependent on need and availability. However, some patterns have arisen across the 18th and 19th centuries. Training of the enslaved started in early childhood with menial tasks, childcare, and assisting older enslaved workers with their daily responsibilities. At about 10, enslaved youths were put to unskilled labor tasks, and for some, soon divided by sex with domestic skills and childbearing for females, and semi-skilled and skilled industrial trades for males. While much of this education was informally passed between enslaved generations, quote, slaveholders often arranged apprenticeships for promising youths, and additional quotes, sometimes set up apprenticeships for their slaves as investments to benefit their heirs, end quotes. Plantation owners may also have hired white artisans to supervise the education of enslaved laborers. Some industrious free contractors even advertised this ability to teach enslaved labor pools as a marketable skill. The skills and training of these skills recounted of enslaved Black people broadly is seldom applied to individual artisans by name. These are rarely recorded. Like those enslaved by John Janvier, history has not recorded their identity, even though their probable skills can be deduced by Janvier's profession. However, similar abilities are deciphered from the probate records of free Black contemporaries within the state in the last years of the 18th century and increasingly through the 19th century. It has been recognized that Delaware had, quote, more free-colored in proportion to its population than any state in the Union, unquote. And as property owners, many left detailed records of their economic lives through probates, city directories, and church records. John Janvier's neighbor, Caesar Evans, who died in 1812, is listed on the 1800 and 1810 St. George Hundred censuses in his probate of 1812 to 20, lists a, quote, lot of carpenter tools. A similar, quote, lot of carpenter tools is listed in the 1822 probate of Alexander Lee, who died in 1822, also of St. George's Hundred. Caleb Milbourne who was alive from about 1800 to 1880 of Wilmington, was an undertaker and coffin maker for nearly 60 years, who buried the free men that I just mentioned above. Upon his death, he bequeathed to his nephew and apprentice, Joseph Price, and we don't know who Joseph's dates, unfortunately, but I quote, and sort of highlighted here on the left, "One of my cabinet maker's workbenches and a set of tools belonging to it, to wit, 2 jack planes, 1 floor plane, 2 smooth planes, 1 handsaw, and 1 tenant saw," end quote. Other professional trades undertaken by free people of color in Delaware, as evidenced by their probates, include shoemaking, various forms of weaving, master shipbuilding, bricklaying, and metalsmithing. And on the right-hand side here, you see one page, I think it's page 2 of his 9-page probate inventory. And almost the entire page is just a list of tools that he used in his cabinet making practice. In the absence of probates and professional listings, historians of enslaved laborers performed by those owned by American craftspeople will instead find evidence of their skills and abilities in regional newspaper ads of the time. Newspapers of 18th century New York and other American cities exhibit 2 types of advertisements about enslaved people. The first is for those who wish to rent them out for a variety of tasks, and that's very rare. And secondly, for those appealing for their return when they attempted to seek freedom by fleeing their oppressors. Simple advertisements, such as the examples that describe the enslaved carpenter and cooper Andrew Sexton, who ran away from James Coates with a set of cooper's tools in 1732, are often among the only sources of personal and professional information about enslaved people found in writing in this period. David Bryan Davis tabulated that by the mid-1700s, enslaved Africans made up 1/3 of all labor in New York City. Coupled with the fact that enslaved people made up 34% of the total population of Brooklyn and 18% of the total population of New York County, his research of period newspapers established that, quote, in 18th century New York and East Jersey, slaves could be found working virtually every kind of job, from building roads, clearing land, cutting timber for firewood, and herding cattle and pigs in the countryside, to such urban skilled occupations as carpentry, shoemaking, blacksmithing, stoneworking, butchering, milling, weaving, and even goldsmithing, end quote. Other regional newspaper sources give evidence of the livelihoods of individuals within the enslaved community that lived in proximity to John Janvier and his workforce. Reading a fraction of these listings opens the imagination to the range of tasks that locally enslaved may have performed within households of Janvier's neighbors around the time of the construction of the Hardcastle chairs. Zach, enslaved at the Elk Forge for ironmongery in nearby Maryland, fled from Thomas John's in 1789 and was recorded in a newspaper based in Wilmington, Delaware, in the hope of anticipating the routes Zach may have taken to achieve a lasting liberty. Jem, a noted enslaved waterman, left Thomas Wirt in 1790. Thomas Crow, whose advertisement is here on the right hand, he's among the region's most prolific and popular clockmakers, and a provider of clock movements for some of Janvier family clock cases. He ran an advertisement for the return of an enslaved woman, Easter, of about 24 years of age, and her infant daughter, Flora, in 1789. The newspapers of Maryland's Eastern Shore, Delaware, and Philadelphia, however, did not list any of this particular form of advertisements for enslaved Africans from John Janvier's workshop. Within St. George's Hundred in the late 1790s, John Janvier's enslavement of humans is not an anomaly. Of the 493 taxable households within St. George's, homesteads like the Janviers themselves, that was recorded in the 1798 tax assessment, 121, or about 25%, contained a total of 448 enslaved humans. These households enslaved from 1 to 21 people each. This total number of households includes 23 that are described as, quote, free blacks who did not own other people. The 1800 federal census for the state of Delaware lists a total of 9,358 households. 6,153 enslaved people, and a very high number of 8,268 free blacks. Enslaved Africans contributed a sizable labor force within these specific populations of St. George Hundred as well as Delaware, and may be seen as an indicator of Black contributions under duress to the livelihood of these communities. Thinking of any one of the households listed in these documents as a nexus of survival and economic interest, especially in cases where enslaved Africans are present within the day-to-day activities of the members of its household, serves as a means to better envision the range of responsibilities that each person present may have shared. Enslavers were also not anomalous among John Janvier's professional contemporaries. Of the 55 fellow cabinet makers, joiners, chair makers, turners, apprentices, and other woodworking artisans that have been recorded during Janvier's working years in Delaware from about 1772 to 1801, at least 15 or 28% were also enslavers. Delaware is composed of 3 counties, and of the 15 woodworkers listed, 8 were for Newcastle County in the north, 1 was in central Kent County, and 6 were from Sussex County in the south. This chart lists them, their stated profession, their location, and the number of humans they can find. Introducing farming into the household economy conceptually expands and complicates the range of skills this labor force may have been expected to perform. While John Janvier Sr. is not remembered as a farmer, at least 5 or 6 of his contemporaries on this list were farmers, but they did not across the board enslave the most people. Large-scale manumissions dominated Delaware farming at this time as growers abandoned tobacco cultivation, which exhausted the soil and demanded large workforces for long periods of time, to grow wheat and other grains instead, which employed lots of workers for shorter amounts of the year. Farmers across the state freed their agricultural slaves by the hundreds, not selling them out of state as it was cheaper to simply hire them back for temporary work, but they needed to keep them nearby. As slavery became a less valuable form of labor within the state and elsewhere, those that were kept in bondage must have exhibited sets of skills that remained profitable to their owners. Many of these trained only in lower skilled seasonal agricultural positions were freed, perhaps leaving enslaved populations of a higher value that were likely also skilled laborers and artisans who could benefit their owners' own trades in their homes or be hired out for limited term projects year round. Noting that the practice of, quote, hiring out enslaved tradespeople was not as well documented in northern cities like Boston as it was in the South, a historian generalized that across early America, it was, quote, usually arranged by word of mouth between 2 parties. Hiring out was a highly personal and informal process. This largely hidden economy of hired labor was likely a large portion of the responsibilities shouldered by the enslaved Africans of St. George's Hundred and other parts of America. Evidence suggests that some enslavers, perhaps Janvier's own sons, John Jr. and Peregrine, who were not recorded as enslavers until after leaving cabinet making entirely, may have kept workers in bondage, not to support their own professional careers, but exclusively to be hired out. Given this new context for the creation of the Hardcastle chairs, there are plenty of individuals who should be attributed with some credit in their manufacture. Sawyers, carvers, assemblers, upholsterers, hardware producers, stainers, deliverers, and more. Inspecting these plain chairs gives little evidence of the specific hands that modified their form. If the work of the elder Janvier is often indistinguishable from that of his sons, it is naive to expect to find marked differences in the work that was performed by his laborers in bondage. Also, the chairs lack any decorative treatment, which could be attributed to a single specialist hand. And in close-up here, the Project Gutenberg ebook for woodworking tools, 1600 and 1900 by Peter C. Walsh, was the source for the image that you see on the right. And that was taken from Thomas Martin's The Circle of the Mechanical Arts in London, 1813. It's a fantastic online source for contemporaneous images of historic tool use. So the chairs, the Hardcastle chairs here are composed of pieces that were first simply sawn and planed from larger boards of mahogany, such as the rear stiles, front legs, stretchers, seat rails, back supports, and crest rail. The back supports were pierced with a different, perhaps a coping type of saw, and smoothed flat to emphasize the silhouette of the knotted design. Two different molding planes were then used to create the fluted design of the leg fronts and upper portions of the rear stiles, as well as the stepped edge of the seat rails. Gouges and chisels were operated to create mortises and tenons to join these sculpted pieces into a rough hole. Then the surface was sanded and stained, and an upholstered seat of rough-cut pine and textiles was fitted into place. These chairs were created with a handful of basic tools, and their makers did not utilize specialized skills for decorative carving, turning, or even chamfered edges to finish the chair backs. Much of the individual components of the Hardcastle chairs could be accomplished by a wide variety of craftspeople of varying proficiency. Three other examples of chairs have been attributed by furniture historian Philip Zimmerman to the shop of the elder John Janvier. One armchair with cabriole legs and a Gothic-inspired chair split, also in the Biggs Museum's collection, has a history of ownership within the Janvier family. Two additional sets of chairs are also in the Gothic style, one plain and one with delicate relief carving throughout the chair back, pictured respectively on the left and right of your view here. And these have a history of ownership by descendants of Janvier's neighbor and patron, William Corbett, who was alive from 1746 to 1818. The three attributed chair styles were probably made earlier than the Hardcastle chairs, but each retains formal similarities, but not always the same similarities to the set documented to Janvier's workshop in 1795. The armchair has a similarly smooth, undecorated back support that is cut without chamfered edges like the Hardcastle example. The same square profile was also used to form the chair's unusual armrests. And you can sort of see this very sort of strange sort of square profiling here. Everything is at 90-degree angles, as is also true of the pierced splat that you see across the back. The plain Corbett family side chair follows the same pattern in which the splat was cut at 90-degree angles from one flat board, and the surface was joined into an uninterrupted plane with the crest rail and the rear stiles. The decoration of these first three examples relies entirely on the profile shaped from the pierced plane of the chair's backs and exhibits no additional carving. The decoratively carved Corbett family chair was likely initially formed in the same way as the preceding three chairs, but was then given over to the talents of a carving specialist, perhaps someone in Janvier's workshop or to yet another hired journeyman. This specialist applied a reductive carving process to the Janvier workshop, to a Janvier workshop's unembellished chair form, and shaved away chamfered rear edges, planed the front into a rhythm of fluted channels and median ridges, reduced the surface of the crest rail to shape a delicate bead across the upper edge, and chip carved and incised flowers and leaves. The backs of the crest rails of all four examples of chairs were all rounded smooth. All four chairs have trapezoid-shaped upholstered slip seats. Both of the Corbett chairs have similarly step molded edges along their seat rails to the Hardcastle set, while the armchair has a more pronounced quarter-round profile. All four chairs have the Hardcastle and the plain Corbett chairs, both with the arrows here, both have similarly constructed feet, tapered and marble, held in place with stretchers in an H formation with one additional stretcher connecting the rear stiles, and their seat rails are mortised through the back stiles. The armchair and carved courbet chair, the decoratively carved courbet chair, both have cabriole legs with similarly carved ball and claw feet, no stretchers, and their seat rails are not mortised through. While these similarities help to reinforce the chair's attributions, their differences may indicate a wide variety of personal interpretations, and these are very little nuanced differences between these chairs, but they do bear a little bit of mentioning. Each contributor rounded the back of their crest rail differently than their contemporaries. The joiner of the plain courbet chair pinned the back seat rail twice into the rear stiles and used 2 wedges to expand his through tenon. But the joiner of the Hardcastle chair only wedged the tenon once and used no wooden pins. The craftspeople of the armchair and plain courbet chairs raised their slats higher in the shoe than the maker of the carved courbet chair, and the cabriole leg chairs have completely different visual transitions into their seat rails. These all demonstrate a range of acceptable variation within one shop's production. So all chairs come from the same shop, but they're actually joined very differently from one another. Comparing the Hardcastle chairs to these 3 other examples associated with the Janvier workshop demonstrates interesting consistencies in one shop's techniques and the labor practices that performed them. The successful design of all 4 chairs relies on a strong silhouette and, except for the carved courbet side chair, a consistently spare use of decorative carving and molding. The consistent simplicity of the majority of Janvier's designs may have allowed a wide variety of laborers to contribute to the construction over his 30-year career. Specialized craftsmen, perhaps like journeyman Thomas Janvier or others who have yet to be identified, may have been hired for the technically advanced carving of cabriole legs and the like. The rest were likely performed by any number of individuals regularly found in the homestead, his apprentices and enslaved workers, as evidenced by the wide variety of idiosyncrasies in each chair design's execution. Lowering the skill level needed to finish a piece of furniture increases the likelihood that it could have been made by any number of laborers. While no assumption can be made about the skill level of an enslaved African in Janvier's homestead, like automation, simplifying the process of furniture making and allowing a level of improvisation increases the likelihood that any number of people could have contributed. So to begin to summarize this paper, this research, I wanted to point out some of the areas that still need to be explored. So much research needs to be done in this process. More work needs to be done with the tax assessments, probate records, and federal census information introduced in this study to determine which craftspeople and shop owners of Delaware were enslavers until 1865 and before 1770. Additionally needed is deep research into the account books of the people that knew and did business with John Janvier and other enslaving craftspeople of Delaware through time, in the hopes that the names of the enslaved might be recorded in their transactions. The research undertaken for this preliminary topic unearthed only 21 names from over 200 enslaved people investigated. What is of special note here is that just within the years 1798 to 1800, 50 enslaved Africans were tied to the fine furniture making industry of Delaware, roughly equal to the number of furniture makers of European descent at the same period. And there is new evidence of free Black woodworkers that have never before been identified. And that's actually not even quite true. So it's 50 enslaved individuals associated with this industry that in a 3-year period of time when there's only probably about 25 woodworkers of this sort working throughout the entire state. The levy court records of the few times a year that judges would hear the cases of Delaware's enslaved community did not help the research of this topic, but the names recorded from that source need to be connected to the households, locations, professions, and accomplishments of their so-called owners. Equally, Delaware's records requesting permission to transport the enslaved across state lines may yield additional names, professions, and evidence of the practice of hiring out. Then, whenever possible, the biographies of these named craftspeople need to be further researched to understand which of the skills they were allowed to perform in their careers of bondage followed them into freedom. Finally, this growing understanding of the communities of color permeating the artisan trades of Delaware should be compared to other parts of the American North, both rural and urban, to see where else this form of credit may be assigned. It is statistically unlikely that enslaved workers were not utilized in support of any and all areas of their households. Given this evidence, it is much fairer to say that neither Janvier nor perhaps any American craftsman was a lone creative genius, but a shrewd opportunist with access to a lot of local talent. This case study proves that John Janvier was not solely responsible for the furniture credited to him, and approaches the probability that his unnamed slaves likely contributed to his professional success and notoriety. In light of the bustling rhythms of the production of the Janvier shop, knocked out by a revolving door of talents, much of Janvier's designs of chairs and even case furniture are better understood as decisions in efficiency that could be performed by any number of available hands. Janvier's reliance on slave labor is directly reflected within his professions his profession as a cabinet maker and across the trades of his artisanal peers and neighbors. These necessary skill sets to work fine woods are reflected in Delaware's free Black communities of this time and for generations to come. Likely named and unnamed enslaved Black craftspeople contributed tremendously and richly to the decorative arts of St. George's Hundred, the state of Delaware, and across the northern United States. That these objects are now prized by museums certifies that they should be the subject of new interpretation that may be important to individuals who have not been equitably represented within American art collections or in the demographics of its visitation. Thank you.